Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Finance Minister, particularly for the acknowledgement towards the Workers' Party of coming up with alternative revenue proposals for the government's consideration. And we did so, of course, knowing that since the introduction of, or the decision to raise GST was announced a few years ago, circumstances have changed. COVID wasn't anticipated, of course. And of course, core inflation right now is at its highest level in 9 years. I think the prices of goods and services is not a point I need to repeat. Minister would know, thanks to CPI information from MAS and MTI, that price pressures will impact Singaporeans, particularly at the low and middle income levels. This is even as the question is important as to raising the GST at this time. Minister made some brief points about it. He had thought about it carefully. But I think the question remains, is this a reasonable thing to do in these circumstances? That's the first question. And the point, I think, arises more acutely when you take into account what market watchers have said about BEPS 2.0, which may well result in corporate tax revenue gains for Singapore. And I think this is a point that has been raised at the start of the week, coinciding with this budget debate. To that end, my first question is, can I ask, what is the government's current estimates, given that there is an implementation deadline of 2023 for BEPS? What is the range of estimates of the net impact of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 on our corporate income tax revenues? I mean, surely the MOF would have prepared itself for these various scenarios. And can I confirm that the MOF does not have these various scenarios planned out? And this really comes up and brings up the other point Minister raised about red herrings, and that somehow when the opposition asks for questions about revenue and expenditure projections, these are red herrings. But it can't be so, because as I mentioned in my budget speech, it's something that many jurisdictions do. I mean, Hong Kong has a medium-range forecast right up to fiscal year 2026, 2027. And they've got assumptions. Of course, you're projecting into the future, so it can't be perfect. And I think people will give the government buffer and leeway for that. But that's incredibly important. And that's precisely why the Workers' Party put forward different revenue streams. Now, Minister rounded off at the end about the importance of information, facts. I completely agree with him. But wouldn't this approach not to make a call for information characterizing it as a red herring, but actually just producing that information, lead to the outcome that the minister himself speaks of, and reduces the prospect of individuals mischaracterizing positions, which one could argue has also been done in the course of this debate. I think there were arguments made in the extreme which were not put forward by WP MPs. I don't think anybody suggested raising personal income tax for the upper tier up to 42% to make up for the GST hole, and that wasn't done. But it was nonetheless characterized as an opposition idea. So I think it's a case of what is good for the goose must be good for the gander. And this is something I hope that can be actually alleviated through more projections, what the government needs, how much it's going to collect, because this will result in a more fruitful debate. In the course of my budget speech, I did make a point about the revenue that the carbon tax will bring in. I hear the minister's point. He said it in the beginning of he said it when he opened the debate. He's saying it now. He doesn't expect carbon tax to bring in new sources of revenue, but still a debate has to be had. What are those numbers? Particularly when you look at utility prices, utility bills for average Singaporeans, which the minister says in his speech are going up. I believe he used a 25-year timeline, but if you follow it in a linear fashion, that's $12 by 2030, an increase. So those numbers should really be brought forward by the government so that we can debate these and talk about whether our people, both at the low and middle income levels, can be supported in a better way. I think Minister raised a number of points. We spoke about the various levers. The other WP MPs, of course, will chip in and make those clarifications with the Minister. But Mr. Chua is not here today. He would be happy to come into this debate, I can assure you. But he is self-isolating just to be on the more safe side. He's not, I think he was a positive yesterday, but then it came out to be a negative. So I think better for him to stay away. But he will definitely come back to this in the course of what happens with BEPS and actually what are those projections that the government is working with vis-a-vis its impact. Number of other points, like I said, I'll let the other WP MPs come in, but I think there's a useful question to ask about the reserves. We've had this exchange in this House a number of times on our position on the reserves. I don't think it's an allusion to it's an accurate reflection to say that first instance you look and turn to the reserves. That's not true. And we've really made the government's own approach informed in this House as to how it also takes a certain approach to change how it deals with its reserves mechanism at quite short intervals. 2008, 2015, we're entering a decade where circumstances are changing quite significantly. Minister himself recognized in his budget speech that I believe there's a review of even healthcare resourcing. Para 239, we are thinking through this healthier SG strategy carefully. It will entail a review of our resourcing approach and healthcare financing schemes, as well as the need for upstream investments in preventive healthcare. So clearly the other numbers that were in his speech about potentially where we could be with healthcare expenditure if we don't keep it in check may not really be what will eventually be the outcome, because there is a review going on.
Mr. Singh, this part is really for clarifications. I will allow preamble, and as leader of opposition, I'm prepared to allow you some leeway, but let's keep to the point.
Mr. Speaker, I take the point. I will.
Before I end, just a reminder to the rest of the members, this is meant for clarification. So if you have some preamble, I'll allow it, but please limit the time. Thank you.
Obliged, Speaker, I will not abuse this. Let me just then come to the point about, before I hand it over to the other colleagues of mine to make clarifications. It was previously said, and the Minister alluded to this, I beg your pardon, the Minister didn't allude to this. It was previously said that we have drawn on our reserves equivalent to 20 years of past budget surpluses. This was a government position vis-a-vis COVID. We've used a generation's worth of savings to combat a crisis of a generation. My colleague Louis Chua asked DPM Hing in his capacity as finance minister previously, after accounting for the draw, where would our reserves be compared to 5 years ago and 10 years ago? And he made the point that this really wasn't answered. And he put the question to the finance minister, Minister Wong, and after having a better fix on the number, 42.9 billion drawn on past reserves, where would our reserves be today as compared to 5 years ago? Is it higher or is it lower? I think that's a question that can be answered in one word. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So I thank the Leader of the Opposition for these comments and questions. There are a few of them, and I will take them in turn. First, on the increase of GST. It is a very difficult decision. It was a very difficult decision for all the reasons I've explained. Recognizing on the one hand the concerns that Singaporeans have about higher prices, but on the other hand, the urgent and very pressing revenue needs we have to address. And that's why I highlighted that I decided eventually to delay the GST and to stagger the increase over 2 years. I suppose Mr. Singh's point is that even that is not enough. And I can understand that some people might feel and be concerned that even that delay and that staggering is not sufficient to address concerns, especially in light of the recent developments in the external environment. And that's why I mentioned just now that the best way to deal with this is, number one, if indeed inflation turns out to be more persistent and higher than expected, which may happen, we will deal with that decisively and separately, and we have the tools and resources to do so. How? Well, we have monetary policy to deal with inflation. we are able to take a series of actions to better secure our energy supplies. And thirdly, we can help households and businesses directly. We have the resources to do so. And if the need arises, we will not hesitate to take all of these actions. So that's one first assurance we have for everyone. The second assurance is that even setting aside additional measures and actions, we have already done a lot, and I've been trying to explain that. Look at the significant help that's on the table today. Household support package this year, plus assurance package and the GST vouchers, both of which have been enhanced, combined together, and both being rolled out this year before the GST goes up. A lot of help which will, for most households, delay the impact of the GST increase by 5 years or more. 5 years or more. So the two taken together, I think, should assure everyone that we are not doing this in a cavalier manner at all. We considered it very, very carefully before we decided to proceed, and making sure that we are taking all the necessary actions and steps and have contingency measures in place to take care of the concerns of every Singaporean. That's number one. On two, on projections and numbers and data, I accept Mr. Singh's point. I was not attempting to characterize it unfairly. I was just sharing my feelings about these repeated requests for information as perhaps distracting us from the real issues. But I accept Mr. Singh's clarification, and I assure him, you have my commitment that we will continue to put out more information as much as possible in order to provide for more informed debates. And I hope he also takes what he said seriously, that the opposition will also exercise leeway in recognizing that these projections in the outer years are inherently fraught with a great deal of uncertainty, especially for a small, little open economy like Singapore, where so many external events can never be predicted with any degree of certainty. So very often, we don't even project GDP beyond a year, right? So when you talk about outer year projections for the economy, for fiscal projections, there will be a very high cone of uncertainty around these numbers. And we therefore want to make sure that if we were to provide any figures, we do not inadvertently mislead people, cause people to have the wrong impression. And I seek the leader of the opposition's understanding too, that in putting out such figures in the future, we may very well get it wrong, because there is a lot of uncertainty when we project into the outer years. But you have my commitment that we will continue to see how we can improve the data and information that we put out. Thirdly, on the reserves, I've explained our position and why changes in the rules done hastily, we think, are not wise, are not prudent, and will come at the detriment of the next generation. If we have to change any rules, we will have to seriously consider them very, very carefully. But if we make any tweaks in parameters, more land sales, more NRIC now, what it basically means in the end, at the end of the day, is that our future generations will be the ones to have to carry the burden. They will have to pay more in taxes in the future. That's what it comes down to. And they will have that much less to deal with any future emergencies, which we all know will come at a more frequent rate in the coming years. So all I say is let's have a care about this, and I do not think it's prudent to make this change now in place of raising the GST or other tax changes, which we can and should do. As for the quantum of reserves, I have actually mentioned that in my speech. I said that our reserves are growing. We won't be able to tell you what the actual figure is for the reasons I've explained. It's not in our national interest. But as I said in my speech, our reserves are growing. But our economy, our needs, the complexity of our needs, and the magnitude of the challenges we face are growing even faster. And what's more important when you drill it down is, are we accumulating more than necessary? And the answer is no. How do we know that this is the case? Because our NIRC, as I mentioned before, we project will continue to grow at a rate that keeps pace with economic growth. That's how we know that we are not over-accumulating. Whatever we are getting from NIRC today at 3.5% of GDP on average over the past few years, we do not expect that to continue rising as a share of GDP. It will keep pace with economic growth, and as I mentioned in my speech, even doing that, we cannot be sure that we can achieve that, but if we are able to do so, it will already be a significant achievement because of all the headwinds that we are facing in the global investment environment. I think I've answered all the questions from Mr. Singh, sir.
Mr. Singh?
Oh, sorry, one more question. BEPS. Yeah. BEPS, the short answer is, again, this is one of those things where it's not, we have been studying this very carefully. And as I mentioned just now on Pillar 1, the rules are still being fine-tuned. It's not over yet. It's still being discussed. Yes, there is the pronouncement of 2023, but I don't know for a fact that this will happen in 2023 because many details are still being worked out. So that's one of the reasons why I mentioned I hesitate to put out any figures at this stage, but taking the earlier point about putting out more information for a more informed debate, we will go back and think about whether we might provide a range of estimates about what the impact of BEPS 2.0 might be for both Pillars 1 and Pillars 2. I would say it would range from neutral to perhaps some increase, but we'll have to look at the figures. And we will provide some figures, hopefully, to help everyone get a better sense of what it might be. But what's more important, especially the point I mentioned, which is that even if Pillars 1 and Pillars 2 combined yield us additional revenue, we will very likely have to reinvest that revenue back into ensuring we remain competitive and attract our fair share of investments. Why? Because the reality is competition for investments is not going to go away just because of BEPS 2.0. In fact, it will get even more intense, and it will intensify in other areas, in other non-tax areas, which we will therefore have to fund and have resources ready for. So even if there is a plus from BEPS 2.0, I am in fact not confident that that additional revenue will help us with our social spending needs, and especially not for our healthcare spending needs, which will continue to rise very sharply.
Mr. Singh?
Thank you, Minister, for the reply. I think it just reinforces the point that I've been trying to make about the alternative revenue streams that the Workers' Party came up with in the course of this debate, knowing that there are quite fundamental changes taking place worldwide where we need a better fix on what the revenue situation will be. I think Minister missed out one point, one question that I also put in my speech about the carbon tax and the estimates that the government has with its increase at the tiers up to 2030. I think those numbers would be appreciated, even though I take Minister's point, as I mentioned in my earlier clarification, that he doesn't foresee this to be a revenue generator, if I can put it that way. But I think this is something that we should have a debate about in good time.